I stood in my destroyed cornfield, watching two women in designer sunglasses laughing as they reversed their luxury cars out of my freshly planted crops. Mud and torn seedlings clung to their expensive wheels like evidence of a crime. The shorter one rolled down her window and called out with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Thanks for the shortcut, farm boy. See you tomorrow." Tomorrow, as if this was their road, as if my family's land was their personal highway. I had spent my life savings turning this neglected farm into something beautiful. 3 months of backbreaking work, gone in one weekend of their entitled rampage. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to document the damage. Row after row of destroyed plants stretched before me like a graveyard of dreams. That is when I realized these Karen sisters had made the biggest mistake of their lives. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. 6 months earlier, I had been just another face in the corporate crowd, trapped in a gray cubicle, counting down the minutes until 5 o'clock. The inheritance letter from my great-uncle's estate felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. 43 acres of prime farmland in rural Tennessee, complete with a century-old farmhouse and outbuildings that had seen better days. I remember the first morning I walked those fields, dew soaking through my city shoes, watching the sunrise paint the rolling hills in shades of gold and amber. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no angry neighbors shouting through thin apartment walls. Just the gentle whisper of wind through tall grass and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. The transformation began immediately. I quit my job, sold my overpriced city apartment, and poured every penny into bringing the farm back to life. The irrigation system came first. Miles of underground pipes and sprinkler heads designed to nurture the crops I planned to grow. Then came the soil preparation, the careful selection of seeds, the installation of proper drainage systems. By spring, I had planted 15 acres of corn, 10 acres of soybeans, and dedicated 5 acres to a vegetable garden that would supply the local farmers market. The remaining land housed a small orchard of apple and peach trees, still young but full of promise. Every morning, I would walk the property with my coffee, checking on the progress, pulling weeds, adjusting irrigation schedules. The private dirt road that cut through the center of my property had been there for decades. The previous owner used it to move equipment between the north and south fields. It was practical, efficient, and entirely contained within my property lines. I never thought twice about it. It was just another feature of the land, like the old oak tree by the pond or the stone fence that marked the eastern boundary. My neighbors seemed friendly enough. I introduced myself at the local hardware store, waved when I saw them at the mailbox, even helped the elderly couple next door fix their fence after a storm. Rural life felt like a return to simpler times, where people looked out for each other and respected each other's property. The farmhouse itself became my sanctuary. I spent evenings on the wraparound porch, listening to crickets and watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. The satisfaction of honest work settled into my bones. Dirt under my fingernails felt like a badge of honor. The ache in my back after a long day meant progress, growth, achievement. I had found my calling. The stress of city life melted away like snow in spring sunshine. Here, surrounded by growing things and open sky, I felt connected to something larger than myself. The land had been in my family for generations, and I was simply the latest guardian of its legacy. Those first few months were pure magic. I watched my crops emerge from the soil like green miracles, reaching toward the sun with determined optimism. The corn grew tall and strong, the soybeans filled out their pods, and the vegetables in my garden flourished beyond my wildest expectations. I started planning for the future, calculating profits, imagining expansion. I had no idea that my peaceful paradise was about to become a battleground. The dirt road that seemed so innocent, so practical, would soon become the weapon that two entitled women would use to destroy everything I had built. But in those early days, as I worked my land and planned my future, I was blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing just beyond my property lines. The first time I saw the silver Mercedes sedan cutting through my property, I assumed it was someone who had gotten lost. Rural roads can be confusing, and GPS systems sometimes send people down private drives by mistake. I was adjusting sprinkler heads near the road when the sleek car slowed down, windows rolled up, air conditioning humming. I waved politely and approached the driver's side. The woman behind the wheel was probably in her 40s, perfectly styled blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her nose. She looked like she belonged in a country club, not on a dusty farm road. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice friendly. "This is actually a private road. You might want to use the main highway to get where you are going." She looked me up and down, taking in my work clothes and dirt-stained hands. Her smile was sharp as a blade. "It is just a road," she said, her voice dripping with dismissive sweetness. "I am sure you do not mind." Before I could respond, she accelerated, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust. I watched her taillights disappear around the bend, feeling a knot of unease form in my stomach. Something about her tone, her attitude, told me this was not a simple misunderstanding. The next day she was back, and this time she brought a friend. The second car was a white BMW, just as expensive and pristine as the first. Two women, cut from the same cloth, treating my property like their personal highway. When I tried to flag them down, they simply drove faster, their tires kicking up gravel and dust that settled on my newly planted seedlings. By the end of the week, it had become a daily routine. Every morning around 8:30, the two cars would appear at the north end of my property, cruise through at whatever speed they felt like, and disappear toward the subdivision on the south side. They were using my farm as a shortcut to avoid the main road traffic. I tried to be understanding. Maybe they were late for work. Maybe they had not realized the extent of the inconvenience. I put up a small, polite sign at the entrance to the road. "Private property, please use main highway." The sign lasted exactly one day before I found it knocked over, tire tracks clearly visible where someone had deliberately run it down. The damage started small. A few seedlings here and there, crushed by tires that strayed from the center of the road. I told myself it was accidental, that they were just being careless. But as the days passed, the damage grew more obvious, more deliberate. I caught them one morning, both cars parked in the middle of my road while the women stood outside, talking on their phones. When I approached, the shorter one looked at me with undisguised irritation. "Do you have a problem?" she asked, her voice ice cold. "This is private property," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I would appreciate it if you would use the public roads." "Property rights work both ways, farm boy," the taller one chimed in. "You cannot just block off roads that people have been using." "People have not been using this road," I replied. "It is part of my farm. It has always been part of my farm." They exchanged a look that made my skin crawl. It was the look of predators who had found prey. "Well, we are using it now," the shorter one said, "and we will continue to use it. It is a free country." They got back in their cars and drove away, but not before deliberately swerving into my corn rows, crushing a dozen plants that had been thriving just moments before. That evening, I stood in my damaged field, staring at the destruction. This was not about convenience or traffic. This was about power, about showing me that they could do whatever they wanted and I could not stop them. The peaceful sanctuary I had built was under siege, and I was beginning to understand that these women were not going to stop until they had taken everything from me. I had no idea how much worse it was going to get. Within 2 weeks of that first confrontation, my private road had become a neighborhood thoroughfare. The Karen sisters had obviously been busy, spreading the word about their convenient shortcut. Every morning brought a parade of cars, SUVs, and pickup trucks, all cutting through my property like it was a public highway. I watched from my kitchen window as strangers drove through my land, some talking on phones, others eating breakfast, all of them treating my farm like their personal convenience. The worst part was the complete disregard for the crops growing on either side of the road. Tires routinely wandered off the packed earth, crushing plants that had taken weeks to establish. I installed new signs, bigger and more visible. Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted. The signs were professional, polite, and completely ignored. Within days, they were vandalized, torn down, or simply driven over. The Karen sisters seemed to take the signs as a personal challenge. Instead of staying on the road, they began deliberately driving through my crops, their expensive cars carving destructive paths through rows of corn and soybeans. When I rushed outside to confront them, they would roll down their windows and wave, smiling like they were greeting an old friend. "Your signs are so aggressive," the shorter one called out during one of these encounters. "We are just trying to get to work. Why do you have to be so hostile?" Hostile. I was being hostile for asking people to stay off my private property. The gaslighting was so blatant it took my breath away. The real devastation came on a weekend in late June. I woke up Saturday morning to the sound of music and laughter coming from my property. When I looked outside, I saw cars parked everywhere, people standing around with drinks in their hands, and a full-scale party happening in my fields. The Karen sisters had apparently told their friends about the community space they had discovered. Dozens of people were trampling through my crops, using my irrigation lines as seeding, and treating my farm like a public park. Children were running through the corn rows. Adults were grilling food on portable barbecues, and someone had even set up a volleyball net in the middle of my soybean field. I called the police, but the dispatcher told me it was a civil matter. Unless someone was being violent or threatening, there was nothing they could do about trespassing on private property. I would have to file complaints through the court system, which could take weeks or months to resolve. By the time the party ended Sunday evening, weeks of careful work had been destroyed. My irrigation system was damaged in 3 places, with broken pipes flooding sections of the field. Tire tracks crisscrossed the entire property like scars on the landscape. Trash was scattered everywhere, and someone had apparently used my tool shed as a bathroom. The financial damage was staggering. I calculated at least $3,000 in destroyed crops, plus another $1,500 in irrigation repairs. But the emotional damage was worse. This was not just property destruction. It was a violation of everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of. Monday morning, the Karen sisters were back to their regular routine, driving through like nothing had happened. When I tried to flag them down, they accelerated, splashing through puddles left by the broken irrigation and sending muddy water across my face. I stood there, soaked and defeated, watching their taillights disappear around the bend. That was when I realized that being polite, being reasonable, being law-abiding was not going to save my farm. These women had declared war on me, and they were winning because they were willing to do things I was not. The harassment escalated from there. They began bringing larger vehicles, encouraging their friends to drive recklessly through my property, and timing their visits to cause maximum disruption. When I was working in the fields, they would honk their horns and rev their engines. When I was trying to repair damage, they would drive through the areas I had just fixed. The worst part was the helplessness. Every phone call to authorities resulted in the same response. Civil matter, file a complaint, hire a lawyer. Meanwhile, my crops continued to die, my investment continued to hemorrhage, and my dream of peaceful farm life turned into a daily nightmare. I realized I was fighting a battle with people who had no moral boundaries, no respect for property rights, and no consequences for their actions. They were bullies in the purest sense, using their sense of entitlement as a weapon against anyone who dared to stand in their way. Something had to change. I just did not know what. The Monday after the block party weekend, I walked my property at sunrise, documenting the devastation with my phone camera. The destruction was worse than I had initially thought. Entire sections of my corn crop had been trampled into the mud. Irrigation lines were not just broken but completely torn out of the ground. Entire tracks ran through every field like wounds that would never heal. I sat on my porch with my calculator and receipts, trying to quantify the damage. The numbers were brutal. Over $4,000 in destroyed crops, $2,000 in irrigation repairs, and another $1,000 in replanting costs. My entire profit margin for the year had been wiped out in a single weekend of suburban terrorism. The police station was my first stop that morning. Officer Martinez listened patiently as I explained the situation, showed him the photos, and provided a detailed account of the harassment. He nodded sympathetically, took notes, and then delivered the crushing blow. "This is really a civil matter," he said, exactly what I had been told on the phone. "Unless someone threatens you physically or commits a violent crime, we cannot arrest people for trespassing. You need to file a complaint with the district attorney's office and probably get a lawyer." "But they are destroying my livelihood," I protested. "This is not just trespassing. This is vandalism, harassment, and economic sabotage." "I understand your frustration," he replied, "but our hands are tied. Property disputes have to go through the courts." I left the police station feeling more defeated than ever. The system was designed to protect people like me, but it was failing catastrophically. The Karen sisters could destroy my property with impunity while I filled out paperwork and waited for justice that might never come. Things got worse when they began targeting my family. My elderly parents had planned to visit for the 4th of July weekend, their first trip to see the farm since I had moved there. They were excited to see what I had built, to share in my achievement. The Karen sisters must have noticed the unfamiliar car in my driveway. Within hours of my parents' arrival, the harassment intensified. Cars began driving through at all hours, honking horns, revving engines, and creating a constant stream of noise and dust. My father, who had fought in Vietnam and rarely showed fear, was visibly shaken by the aggressive behavior. "Who are these people?" he asked, watching a pickup truck deliberately swerve through my vegetable garden. "What do they want?" I did not have an answer. The harassment had moved beyond any rational explanation. It was pure malice, designed to make my life miserable for the simple crime of asking people to respect my property. The psychological warfare escalated when I discovered that the Karen sisters had been spreading rumors about me in the community. The clerk at the hardware store mentioned, almost casually, that she had heard I was unstable and threatening neighbors. The post office worker asked if I was having problems with anger management. They were systematically destroying my reputation, painting me as the aggressor in a conflict they had started. Anyone who heard their version of events would think I was a crazy farmer who was harassing innocent women just trying to get to work. The final confrontation came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in mid-July. I was repairing irrigation lines when both cars pulled up and parked directly in front of me. The Karen sisters got out, their faces set with grim determination. "We need to talk," the shorter one said, her voice dripping with false concern. "This has gone far enough." "You are absolutely right," I replied, straightening up. "This harassment has to stop." "We are not harassing anyone," the taller one snapped. "We are simply using a road that has been here for decades. You are the one who is being unreasonable." "This is private property," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You have no right to be here." They exchanged that predatory look again, and I knew I was about to hear something that would change everything. "We will continue to use this road," the shorter one said, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Because we can. Because there is nothing you can do to stop us. And if you keep putting up signs and making trouble, we will make sure everyone in this community knows exactly what kind of person you really are." They got back in their cars and drove away, leaving me standing in the ruins of my irrigation system, finally understanding the true scope of what I was facing. This was not about traffic or convenience. This was about power, about showing me that they could take whatever they wanted and I was powerless to stop them. That night I sat on my porch in the dark, listening to the crickets and watching the fireflies, trying to figure out how my dream had become such a nightmare. The system had failed me. The authorities could not help me. I was alone, facing an enemy that had no moral boundaries and no fear of consequences. That was when I realized I had to stop playing by their rules and start playing by mine. The transformation began that night, alone on my porch with a laptop and a burning need for justice. If the system would not protect me, I would have to protect myself. But I was not going to become like them. I was going to be smarter, more methodical, and completely legal. I started with research. Tennessee property law, trespassing statutes, and civil remedies for property damage. I read every legal blog, every forum post, and every court case I could find. The internet is full of stories about property disputes, and many of them offered creative solutions that worked within the bounds of the law. The first thing I learned was that property owners have more rights than most people realize. Private roads, in particular, are protected by specific statutes that allow owners to control access, install barriers, and even recover damages from unauthorized use. The key was documentation and proper legal notice. I spent 3 days creating a comprehensive legal framework for my property. New signs with specific legal language, certified letters to the Karen sisters formally notifying them of trespassing violations, and a detailed log of every incident with dates, times, and photographic evidence. I was building a case that would stand up in court. But I also began studying my enemies. The Karen sisters had shown me their greatest weakness during our confrontations, their cars. These were not just vehicles to them. They were symbols of status, wealth, and power. The shorter one drove a brand new Mercedes S-Class, probably worth $80,000. The taller one owned a BMW X5, nearly as expensive. These cars were their pride and joy, their most precious possessions. I followed them discreetly and legally, learning their routines. They both lived in the upscale subdivision south of my property, in houses that probably cost more than I would make in 5 years of farming. They used my road every weekday morning between 8:15 and 8:30, and again in the evening between 5:30 and 6. They were creatures of habit, predictable and vulnerable. The local ordinances provided the key to my strategy. Rural counties have specific regulations about private road usage, designed to protect agricultural operations from interference. I discovered that unauthorized use of private agricultural roads could result in significant financial penalties, especially if the usage interfered with farming operations. I also learned about something called attractive nuisance liability. If someone creates a condition that attracts trespassers and those trespassers are injured, the property owner can be held responsible. But the law works both ways. If trespassers create hazardous conditions on private property, they can be held liable for resulting damages. My plan began to take shape. It would be multifaceted, completely legal, and designed to hit the Karen sisters where it would hurt the most, their wallets and their precious cars. I would not be cruel or vindictive, but I would be thorough and implacable. The first phase involved proper documentation. I installed security cameras at key points along the road, hidden but functional, capturing clear images of every vehicle that entered my property. I also set up motion sensors that would alert me to activity, allowing me to respond quickly to any intrusion. The second phase was legal notification. I sent certified letters to both women, formally notifying them that they were trespassing on private property and that continued violations would result in legal action. The letters were crafted by a property rights attorney I had consulted, using language that would hold up in court. The third phase was the most important, creating consequences for their actions. I researched techniques that other property owners had used successfully, methods that were completely legal but highly effective at deterring trespassers. The key was making the cost of using my road higher than the benefit they gained from the shortcut. I spent 2 weeks preparing, purchasing materials, and setting up the systems I would need. Every aspect of my plan was carefully considered and thoroughly researched. I consulted with local law enforcement to ensure that my methods were legal, and I documented everything for the inevitable legal challenges that would follow. The beauty of my plan was its simplicity. I would not have to confront the Karen sisters directly or engage in any kind of harassment. I would simply make it impossible for them to continue using my property without facing significant consequences. The law was on my side, and I was finally going to use it to its full advantage. As I put the finishing touches on my preparations, I felt a sense of calm determination that I had not experienced in months. I was no longer a victim, helplessly watching my property be destroyed. I was a strategist, carefully planning a response that would end this conflict once and for all. The Karen sisters had taught me that being reasonable and polite was not enough. They had shown me that some people only respond to consequences, not conversations. They had made the rules of engagement, and now I was going to play by those rules. They were about to learn that the quiet farmer they had been bullying was not as helpless as they thought, and their precious cars were about to pay the price for their arrogance. The morning of reckoning arrived on a Tuesday in early August. I had been watching the weather reports for weeks, waiting for the perfect conditions. A brief but heavy thunderstorm had passed through the night before, leaving my dirt road soft and muddy, exactly as I had planned. I was up before dawn making final preparations. The security cameras were positioned and recording. The motion sensors were active. The legal documentation was complete and ready. Most importantly, the trap was set. At exactly 8:23, the motion sensors chimed on my phone. I watched from my kitchen window as the silver Mercedes approached the entrance to my property. Behind it, the white BMW followed at its usual distance. They were creatures of habit, predictable to the minute. The Mercedes hit the first obstacle about 50 yards down the road. I had spent days preparing it, using techniques I had learned from construction forums and agricultural websites. Completely legal, fully documented, and devastating to expensive vehicles with low ground clearance. The sound of the Merced's bottoming out echoed across the morning stillness. Through my binoculars, I could see the shorter Karen's sister gripping the steering wheel, her face twisted with confusion and rage. The car was stuck, its luxury undercarriage wedged against the carefully prepared obstacle. The BMW, following too closely to stop, suffered the same fate moments later. Both cars were trapped, their pristine paint jobs already showing the effects of their unauthorized journey through my property. I gave them 15 minutes to assess their situation before I appeared, walking calmly down the road with my phone in hand, recording everything. The Karen sisters were standing beside their damaged vehicles, their designer clothes splattered with mud, their faces red with fury. "What did you do?" the shorter one screamed, pointing at me with a perfectly manicured finger. "You sabotaged the road. This is illegal. We are calling the police." "Please do," I replied, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I would love to have them here to witness this." I pulled out a folder of documents that I had prepared for this moment. Copies of my property deeds, the certified letters I had sent them, photographs of the damage they had caused to my crops, and detailed records of every trespassing incident. "What you have done here is called criminal trespassing," I continued, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had done his homework. "You are currently on private property, without permission, after being formally notified that your presence is unwelcome. Your vehicles have caused thousands of dollars in damage to my crops and irrigation system." "You cannot do this," the taller one shouted. "We have rights. We have been using this road for months." "Using it illegally," I corrected, "and now you are going to pay for that mistake." I showed them the security camera footage on my tablet, months of evidence showing their repeated violations of my property rights. Every incident was documented, time-stamped, and legally admissible. Their faces went pale as they realized the scope of my preparation. "You have two choices," I said, closing the folder. "You can wait here while I call the police and have you arrested for criminal trespassing, or you can call a tow truck and get your vehicles off my property. Either way, you will be receiving a bill for the damage you have caused." The shorter one pulled out her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "Hello, I need police assistance. We are being held hostage by a crazy farmer who sabotaged a public road." I waited patiently while she spoke to the dispatcher, knowing that the officer who would respond was someone I had already consulted about my legal rights. When she hung up, I smiled. "Officer Martinez will be here in about 15 minutes, I said. "He is already familiar with your case. I filed a formal complaint last week, along with all the evidence of your trespassing and property damage." The change in their demeanor was immediate and satisfying. The arrogance drained out of their faces, replaced by the dawning realization that they had been outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated. Officer Martinez arrived with a second patrol car, their lights flashing in the morning sunlight. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking notes and photographs. When he spoke to me, his tone was respectful and supportive. "Mr. Johnson, I see you have implemented the property protection measures we discussed. Are these the individuals who have been trespassing on your land?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "They are currently in violation of the formal notice I served them 2 weeks ago. Their vehicles have caused additional damage to my property this morning." The Karen sisters tried to interrupt, but Officer Martinez held up his hand. "Ladies, You need to understand that this is private property. You have no legal right to be here. Mr. Johnson has documented extensive damage to his crops and irrigation system caused by unauthorized vehicle traffic. But we have been using this road for months, the shorter one protested. Illegally, Martinez replied. Length of time does not create legal rights to use private property. You have been formally notified that your presence is unwelcome. Continuing to trespass is a criminal offense. The tow trucks arrived an hour later, their drivers shaking their heads at the expensive cars stuck in the mud. The extraction process was lengthy and expensive, with both vehicles suffering significant undercarriage damage. The repair bills would be substantial. As the Karen sisters waited for their rides home, their ruined designer clothes and defeated expressions told the story of their downfall. They had learned too late that actions have consequences and that bullies sometimes meet their match. I stood on my property, watching their cars disappear on the backs of tow trucks, feeling a sense of justice that I had not experienced in months. The war was over, and I had won it without firing a shot. The aftermath of that Tuesday morning spread through the community like wildfire. Word travels fast in rural areas, and the story of the Karen sisters' downfall became the talk of the local coffee shop, hardware store, and farmer's market. The narrative had shifted completely, from unstable farmer harassing innocent women to determined property owner standing up to entitled bullies. The legal consequences were swift and comprehensive. My attorney filed civil suits against both women for property damage, trespassing, and harassment. The documentation I had collected made the cases airtight. Their insurance companies settled quickly, covering not just the immediate damage, but also my legal fees and compensation for lost income. The criminal charges were more satisfying. Both women were convicted of criminal trespassing and ordered to pay substantial fines. The judge, a rural landowner himself, was particularly unsympathetic to their claims of innocence. His closing remarks became local legend. Property rights are the foundation of our society. When people think they can ignore those rights without consequences, they undermine the very fabric of our community. The Karen sisters' attempts at damage control only made things worse. Their social media posts complaining about crazy farmers and hostile locals were screenshot and shared throughout the community, providing further evidence of their entitled attitudes. Their reputation in the subdivision suffered irreparable damage, with neighbors finally understanding the true nature of the people they had been living next to. My farm returned to its natural state of peaceful productivity. The crops recovered better than expected, and the fall harvest exceeded my projections. The irrigation system, rebuilt with insurance money, was more efficient than the original. The entire property seemed to breathe easier without the constant stress of unwanted intrusions. The community's response was overwhelmingly positive. Local farmers stopped by to share their own stories of property disputes and to congratulate me on standing up to the bullies. The hardware store owner offered a discount on future purchases. The post office worker apologized for believing the rumors that had been spread about me. Most importantly, the harassment stopped completely. The Karen sisters found new routes to their jobs, ones that did not involve trespassing on private property. When I encountered them in town, they looked away quickly, their former arrogance replaced by the uncomfortable awareness of people who had learned expensive lessons about consequences. I spent the following months reflecting on the lessons I had learned. The most important was that bullies only succeed when good people allow them to. The system had not failed me. I had initially failed to use the system properly. Once I understood my rights and was willing to assert them, The law worked exactly as it was designed to. The experience also taught me about the importance of documentation and preparation. Emotions and good intentions are not enough when dealing with determined adversaries. Legal rights must be backed up by evidence, proper procedures, and the willingness to follow through on consequences. Today, my farm thrives in the peace that I had originally sought. The sunrise still paints the fields in gold, the irrigation system hums quietly in the background, and the crops grow strong and healthy. The dirt road remains exactly what it was always meant to be, a practical path for moving equipment between fields, not a highway for entitled suburbanites. I have become something of a local resource for other property owners dealing with similar issues. My experience has shown that individual property rights, when properly asserted and legally protected, can prevail against even the most determined bullies. The key is understanding that some people only respond to consequences, not conversations. The Karen sisters taught me that lesson the hard way. I made sure they learned it the expensive way. Sometimes, that is the only language that bullies understand.